August 1, 1941. Bethpage, Long Island. The air shimmered in the summer heat as mechanics cleared the runway for a test unlike any before. Chief Engineer Robert Hall climbed into the cockpit of an aircraft so large it seemed impossible for a single engine to lift. The sleek fighters and scout planes parked nearby looked like toys beside it. The machine was enormous, a barrel-shaped fuselage, vast wings, and a tail that towered over the hangar roofs. Hall adjusted his harness, gave a thumbs up, and throttled forward. The engine roared, a deep, thunderous growl that rolled across the airfield. Slowly, almost reluctantly, the prototype began to move. To the Navy officials watching from the ground, the sight bordered on absurd. The aircraft looked ungainly, bloated, even clumsy, a flying warehouse, not a precision weapon. Some muttered that it was too heavy, too complicated, too much of everything. But as the prototype lifted its nose and broke free from the ground, climbing steadily into the blue, something extraordinary was taking shape. The biggest single-engine plane ever built for the US Navy was airborne. This was the prototype of what would become the Grumman Avenger, the aircraft that would sink more enemy ships than any other American plane in history. But no one watching that first takeoff could have guessed that. To them, it was an experiment on the edge of failure. And yet, behind its overweight frame and tangled systems lay something brilliant, a machine that would prove that complexity, if built with purpose, could become the ultimate weapon. The journey to that day began 2 years earlier, in 1939. The United States Navy faced a growing problem. Its main torpedo bomber, the Douglas TBD Devastator, had entered service just 2 years before, but already it was outdated. Aviation technology was moving at a breakneck pace. Aircraft that had seemed modern in 1937 were now too slow, too fragile, and too limited for what the coming war demanded. The Navy issued a new requirement: build a replacement that could do everything the Devastator could not. The specifications were so demanding that many engineers thought they were a joke. The Navy wanted a top speed of 300 miles per hour, a combat range of over 1,000 miles, an internal bomb bay capable of carrying either a full-size torpedo or several 500-pound bombs, armor plating for the crew, self-sealing fuel tanks, and even a powered turret for defense, all in one airframe that could still operate from aircraft carriers. It was a wish list bordering on fantasy. 13 companies stepped forward with proposals. Most didn't make it past the paper stage. Only 2 designs impressed the Navy enough to move forward, one from Vought Aircraft and another from the Grumman Corporation, a rising star in naval aviation. The 2 designs couldn't have been more different. Vaught's entry, the XTBU-1, was sleek, elegant, and visually refined. It looked like the future of flight, with clean lines and aerodynamic grace. Grumman's design, by contrast, looked like a caricature of its smaller Wildcat fighter, swollen, bulky, and strangely proportioned. It wasn't beautiful. It was practical. Initially, the Navy favored the Vought design. But then reality intervened. Vought was already drowning in production orders for another aircraft, the soon-to-be-legendary F-4U Corsair. There was simply no capacity left to build a new torpedo bomber on schedule. The contract was transferred to Grumman, whose reputation for rugged, dependable designs outweighed their lack of elegance. Leroy Grumman, the company's founder, gathered his engineers and laid out the challenge: we are building an airplane that has to come back every time. It wasn't about beauty or speed. It was about survival. The team, led by Robert Hall and William Schwendler, began designing not a work of art, but a flying fortress that could take punishment and keep flying. From the start, every feature added complexity. The internal bomb bay required a new kind of hydraulic door mechanism that could operate even after taking damage. The dorsal turret would be powered by electricity instead of hydraulics, a bold choice, since no such system had yet worked reliably in combat. The folding wings were an even greater puzzle. The Avenger's 54-foot wingspan was too large for carrier elevators, yet the Navy insisted it must fit. One morning, during a design meeting, Leroy Grumman paused over the problem. He grabbed a pink eraser from his desk, stuck 2 paper clips into it, and began to bend them back and forth. The team watched as he found the solution: a compound hinge that would let the wings fold both upward and backward simultaneously, reducing the width to just 18 feet. This became the famous stow wing mechanism, a small stroke of genius born from a pink eraser that would later define decades of naval aircraft design. By late 1940, the prototype, now designated XTBF-1, was taking shape. The aircraft would use the most powerful engine available, the Wright R2600, a 14-cylinder radial capable of producing 1,700 horsepower. Even so, it barely managed to lift the Avenger's enormous weight. Fully loaded, the plane tipped the scales at nearly 16,000 pounds, the heaviest single-engine aircraft ever built for any navy. To critics, it was an impossible design, a turkey, a flying brick. Inside Grumman, it was a test of everything they believed about engineering, that simplicity was overrated, and that real strength came from durability and precision. On December 30th, 1940, before the prototype had even flown, the Navy ordered 286 Avengers off the drawing board. The urgency was clear, war was approaching, and there was no time for perfection. The engineers at Grumman had to make the impossible work, and fast. The morning of the first flight was thick with tension. The Avenger had taken years of planning, endless redesigns, and sleepless nights, and now its creators would see whether all that complexity would even leave the ground. As Robert Hall eased the throttle forward, the aircraft surged ahead with a deep metallic growl. The huge propeller bit into the air, and for a long moment it seemed that the airplane might simply refuse to rise. But then the nose lifted, the wheels left the runway, and the pregnant beast, as some mechanics had mockingly called it, began to climb. For a few precious minutes, the Avenger flew as steady as any aircraft Grumman had ever built. The controls were heavy, demanding constant correction, but the machine stayed in the air. Its systems, the bomb bay doors, the turret, the landing gear, all functioned as designed. For a company that prided itself on reliability, that alone was a triumph. But success came wrapped in warning signs. The Avenger flew like a truck. The controls felt sluggish, the climb rate was poor, and its sheer size made it difficult to maneuver. Navy observers watching from the ground exchanged uneasy glances. Too big, one muttered. Too complicated, said another. And yet, no one could deny that it worked, at least for the moment. Then, on November 28, 1941, disaster struck. The prototype caught fire in midair over Brentwood, New York. Flames licked through the engine cowling and raced down the fuselage. Test pilots Robert Hall and Gordon Israel managed to bail out, their parachutes blossoming just before the aircraft crashed into a wooded area. The wreckage burned for hours. The prototype was destroyed. Critics pounced. The Avenger was labeled a failure before it had even entered production. Its electrical systems were too vulnerable, its wing-folding mechanism too complex, and its heavy frame a hazard to pilots. Voices inside the Navy suggested cancelling the program entirely. The war hadn't even reached America yet, and the Avenger seemed doomed. But Leroy Grumman refused to give in. The second prototype was already nearing completion, and rather than slow down, his team accelerated. Engineers swarmed over every drawing, fixing, reinforcing, improving. They replaced unreliable wiring with new insulation, added fireproofing around the fuel system, and rebalanced the control surfaces for smoother handling. Every failure became data, every setback a step toward improvement. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor just 10 days later, everything changed. The United States was at war, and suddenly, there was no time for doubts. The Navy needed torpedo bombers, now. The second prototype rolled out in early January 1942, and despite the loss of the first, the Avenger project surged forward. On January 3rd, the first production model, the TBF-1, was completed. Less than 5 months after the fire, Grumman had not only rebuilt the design but had turned it into a weapon ready for combat. By spring, the first squadrons were training with their new aircraft. Pilots who had flown the old Devastators were astonished. The Avenger felt completely different, slower to respond but stable and forgiving once trimmed. Its engine could take punishment and keep turning. Its cockpit, positioned high above the fuselage, gave the pilot a commanding view of the sea ahead, even if visibility on landing was tricky. The first batch of Avengers reached Pearl Harbor in May 1942, barely 5 months after America's entry into the war. 6 of them were assigned to Torpedo Squadron 8, an experienced but battered unit preparing for one of the most decisive battles in history, Midway. When the carrier USS Hornet sailed for the Pacific, those 6 Avengers were left behind. They arrived just hours too late to join the fleet, instead being stationed at the airstrip on Midway Island itself. As Japanese carriers approached the atoll, 6 volunteer crews climbed into their brand new Avengers. Many had never flown the plane in combat, some had never even flown beyond sight of land. But they took off anyway, heading into the vast Pacific sky. At 7:10 a.m. on June 4, 1942, the Avengers of Midway began their first attack run against one of the most formidable naval forces ever assembled, for Japanese carriers guarded by elite Zero fighters. The Avengers were heavy, still untested, and slower than any fighter in the sky. But their crews pressed on, flying low across the waves toward the enemy ships. The Japanese combat patrols descended on them with brutal efficiency. The Avengers' turrets spat tracers into the air, but the odds were impossible. One by one, the aircraft took hits. Fuel lines ruptured, control cables snapped, engines caught fire, and still, they kept flying. Ensign Albert Ernest's Avenger, riddled with holes, lost its hydraulics, its radio, and nearly all instruments, yet the engine kept running. His turret gunner was lost, his radio man wounded, but somehow, he brought the plane back to Midway, crash landing on the island's runway. When engineers examined the wrecked aircraft, they counted dozens of bullet holes and cannon impacts. The plane had been struck by 9 20mm rounds and more than 60 machine gun bullets. And it had still returned. Every system critics had mocked, the armor, the self-sealing tanks, even the heavy wiring, had done exactly what it was designed to do. Of the 6 Avengers that took off, 5 were lost. But 1 came home, and that single aircraft would change everything. When the engineers analyzed what had happened, they realized the truth. The Avenger was not fragile at all. It was nearly indestructible. The wreckage from Midway arrived at Grumman's factory like a message from the front lines. The aircraft looked as though it had flown through a storm of metal, the fuselage torn, the wings shredded, yet the main structure had held. Mechanics studying it realized that everything critics had complained about was exactly what had saved it. The thick armor plating, the reinforced cockpit, the redundant wiring systems, all of it had turned a flying brick into something that could absorb punishment and still bring its pilot home. The engineers gathered around the battered machine in silence. Leroy Grumman broke it with just one line: "It did what we built it to do." In that moment, the Avengers' reputation shifted. What had once been considered over-engineering now looked like foresight. The Navy, desperate for reliable aircraft, placed massive new orders. The ugly plane had proven itself in the hardest possible test, combat. Production ramped up at breathtaking speed. The assembly lines at Bethpage ran day and night, floodlit like small cities. Women joined the workforce in huge numbers, many of them building components for the Avenger, wiring harnesses, turrets, control panels. Each aircraft required over 25,000 parts, and yet the system worked with clockwork precision. Crate-stamped TBF was shipped by rail to bases across the country, and the Avenger began appearing on carrier decks from Hawaii to the Atlantic coast. By late 1942, Avengers were serving in nearly every major naval battle. Their first large-scale test came during the Guadalcanal campaign. Conditions there were brutal, tropical heat, constant rain, and improvised airstrips carved out of jungle mud. The Avengers' reliability quickly made it a favorite among ground crews. Mechanics could swap out engines in hours, and the aircraft's rugged design allowed it to operate in conditions that would have grounded more delicate planes. Pilots, too, learned to trust it. The Avenger was not fast. It could barely reach 275 miles per hour when fully loaded, but it was steady, predictable, and forgiving. You could fly it on one engine cylinder short, with half the controls jammed, and it would still get you home. Its wide wings made for smooth carrier landings, and its internal bomb bay allowed clean aerodynamics for long-range missions. It was, in every sense, a workhorse, and one that earned respect through survival. By early 1943, Avengers had replaced the old Devastators entirely. They began to appear in new roles beyond torpedo bombing. Equipped with depth charges, they hunted submarines along the Atlantic coast. Fitted with radar pods under the wings, they scouted ahead of fleets at night. The plane's vast interior allowed endless adaptation, a flying Swiss Army knife for naval warfare. At the same time, Grumman's engineers continued improving the design. They introduced the TBF-1C model with additional wing-mounted machine guns for self-defense, upgraded the radio systems, and redesigned the cockpit canopy for better visibility. Production became so intense that when Grumman's factories reached capacity, the Navy handed blueprints to General Motors' Eastern Aircraft Division. GM's plants in New Jersey and Maryland began churning out nearly identical versions, designated TBM instead of TBF. By 1944, nearly 10,000 Avengers had been produced. That number alone was staggering, more than any other torpedo bomber in history. But the real story wasn't in the statistics. It was in what the aircraft accomplished. In June 1944, the Avengers took part in the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the massive air battle over the Philippine Sea. While fighters dominated the headlines, It was the Avengers that struck the decisive blows against Japanese carriers and supply ships. Operating from carriers like the USS Essex and USS Bunker Hill, they launched hundreds of miles from the fleet, carrying torpedoes and 1,000-pound bombs. The mission profiles were grueling. Fly for hours at wave-top height, release the weapon at precisely the right moment, then climb through anti-air fire to safety, if safety even existed. The Avengers' design made such missions possible. The self-sealing fuel tanks prevented catastrophic leaks, and its sturdy frame resisted the shockwaves of near misses. More than once, pilots returned with holes large enough to see daylight through the fuselage, only to discover the damage had not reached vital systems. In one recorded case, an Avenger crew returned from a strike with over 150 punctures. The tail gunner later recalled seeing daylight through the floor of his compartment, and yet the aircraft landed safely. It wasn't luck, it was engineering. The legend grew. Squadron by squadron, pilots began to call the Avenger the Ironworks finest, a reference to Grumman's nickname among naval aviators. They trusted it to take them out and bring them home again, no matter how rough the mission. By mid-1943, the Avenger had become a symbol of endurance, the kind of machine that defined the difference between survival and disaster. For a navy fighting a war across thousands of miles of ocean, that reliability was priceless. But the Avenger's true transformation was yet to come. As the Pacific War pushed toward Japan, the aircraft that had been mocked for being too slow, too big, and too complicated would find itself facing the most dangerous targets of all, and proving, once again, that the impossible machine could do what no one else dared. By the summer of 1944, the Pacific was a map of advancing blue arrows. The U.S. Navy's carrier task forces pushed deeper toward Japan, and the Avenger was now everywhere, filling carrier decks, patrolling coastlines, escorting convoys. Once dismissed as an awkward torpedo bomber, it had become the Navy's go-to aircraft for almost everything that required reach and reliability. The true test came with the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944. The Japanese Navy launched one of its largest air offensives in history, sending hundreds of bombers and fighters toward the American fleet. Above them flew U.S. Hellcats, slicing through the sky in the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But while the fighters claimed the headlines, the Avengers performed the work that decided the outcome. Operating from carriers like USS Enterprise, USS Lexington, and USS Bunker Hill, Avenger squadrons launched wave after wave of strikes on Japanese carriers, battleships, and fuel depots. Each crew endured hours in the cramped cockpit, the pilot up front, the turret gunner behind him, and the radio man crouched in the narrow belly of the plane. The noise was constant. The thunder of the engine, the hum of the turret motors, the click of radio chatter layered over the drone of wind. When they finally reached the Japanese fleet, the sky was chaos. Flak erupted from every direction, black clouds of shrapnel blooming like poisonous flowers. Pilots dropped to sea level, skimming the waves at terrifying speed. A single mistake could mean disaster. Yet the Avengers pressed on. They released their torpedoes so close to the targets that some aircraft were nearly struck by the blast of their own weapons. The results were devastating. Several Japanese ships were crippled or destroyed, and the attack signaled the beginning of the end for Japan's carrier fleet. One commander later remarked, "The Avengers didn't just deliver torpedoes, they delivered inevitability." But the Avengers' role kept expanding. As Japan shifted to defensive warfare, the Navy needed an aircraft that could do more than just sink ships. The Avengers' large internal bay and long range made it perfect for new missions, bombing inland airfields, scouting enemy convoys, laying mines, and even rescuing downed pilots. With its steady flight and roomy interior, it became an ideal platform for radar and electronic equipment. Soon, special night attack versions patrolled in total darkness, guided only by the faint green glow of early radar screens. By late 1944, Avengers were flying from tiny escort carriers supporting the invasion of the Philippines. Their crews faced a new and terrifying challenge: suicide attacks from Japanese pilots who turned their planes into guided missiles. The Avengers' strong frame and defensive turret made it one of the few aircraft that could meet these threats head-on. Gunner crews learned to stay alert every second of every flight, sometimes firing before the enemy was even visible. On October 24th, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement in history, Avengers struck from dozens of carriers across the Pacific. Their mission was simple and nearly impossible: find and sink the massive Japanese battleships Musashi and Yamato before they could reach the American invasion fleet. At dawn, squadrons of Avengers, Hellcats, and Helldivers climbed into the humid sky. The Musashi appeared below, enormous and armored beyond belief. Even from the air, It looked invincible, a mountain of steel surrounded by a storm of anti-aircraft fire. Pilots dove through flak so thick it looked like smoke. Torpedoes slammed into the water, streaking toward the battleship's hull. Over and over, Avengers circled back, rearming on nearby carriers, returning again and again. For hours the battle raged. The Musashi's guns filled the air with exploding shells, but the Avengers refused to break off. They attacked from both sides, overwhelming the ship's defenses. Finally, after taking over 20 torpedo and bomb hits, the great battleship slowed, listing heavily. A few hours later, she slipped beneath the waves. When word reached the carriers, there was no celebration, only quiet awe. The Musashi had been one of the largest, most powerful ships ever built, and it had fallen to the steady, relentless pressure of aircraft like the Avenger. What brute naval artillery could not do, patient endurance and precision flying had accomplished. The Navy took note. The Avenger's ability to stay in the air for 8 or even 9 hours, carry heavy loads, and absorb punishment made it the perfect foundation for the new kind of war America was now fighting, one based on reach, persistence, and flexibility. After Letta Gulf, the Avengers became the fleet's indispensable workhorse. They flew anti-submarine patrols in the South China Sea, hunted enemy shipping near Taiwan, and supported Marines landing on Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Crews began to customize their planes with names and nose art: Paper Doll, Little Lulu, Heavenly Body, symbols of humor and humanity in a relentless war. Some Avengers even carried tiny life rafts and medical kits, turning them into makeshift rescue planes. When a pilot went down at sea, an Avenger could circle overhead, drop smoke markers, and radio for a destroyer to pick him up. It wasn't glamorous work, but to the men pulled from the ocean, it was life itself. By early 1945, there was almost no mission the Avenger couldn't perform. It had become the Swiss Army knife of naval aviation, part bomber, part scout, part rescue craft. Every improvement, every adaptation, had been born from necessity, from the endless demands of a war fought across an ocean. But even as its reputation grew, the Avenger was about to take part in one of the strangest and most important missions of the entire war, a story that would link it forever with a young pilot whose destiny reached far beyond the cockpit. In the summer of 1944, among the countless young men trained to fly the Avenger, one stood out, a tall, polite 20-year-old from Connecticut named George Herbert Walker Bush. Fresh out of flight school, he was one of the youngest naval aviators in the entire U.S. fleet. Assigned to Torpedo Squadron 51 aboard the carrier USS San Jacinto, Bush was given command of an Avenger, a 3-man crew, and missions that demanded precision, courage, and endurance in equal measure. To his fellow pilots, the Avenger was a strange blend of comfort and claustrophobia. The cockpit sat high with a panoramic view ahead, but the fuselage behind was a maze of cables, radio panels, and ammunition belts. The turret gunner sat alone under a glass dome, surrounded by the rattle of metal and the echo of his own breathing. Below, the radio man crouched in the narrow belly compartment, monitoring instruments in near darkness. Each flight meant hours in this steel capsule, buffeted by wind and noise, bound together by trust. By September 1944, the San Jacinto was operating off the Japanese-held Bonin Islands, striking at radio installations and shipping routes. On the morning of September 2nd, Bush's crew was briefed on their target, a radio tower on the island of Chichijima, protected by heavy anti-air fire. Their orders were clear: descend through flak, hit the target, and escape to open sea. At 7:15 a.m., Bush's Avenger rolled down the carrier deck, engine roaring, wings loaded with bombs. The ocean below sparkled with sunlight, deceptively calm. As the squadron approached Chichijima, the sky erupted. Tracer fire streaked upward from the island like a fountain of light. Bush pressed on, diving toward the target, the island filling his windshield. He released his bombs, direct hits on the tower, but a moment later, a flash of orange lit the cockpit. An explosion rocked the aircraft. Flames burst from the engine compartment, filling the cockpit with smoke. The intercom went dead. Bush leveled the Avenger and pulled it away from the island, but the fire spread fast, licking at the control cables. With the island's cliffs falling behind him, he knew the aircraft wouldn't make it. He shouted for the crew to bail out. Bush climbed onto the wing as the Avenger pitched downward, then leapt clear. His parachute opened just in time. Below, the plane hit the water in a burst of steam and debris. Bush splashed down hard, swallowed by waves. When he surfaced, the Avenger was gone, only smoke and oil marking the spot where it had hit. He inflated his life raft and drifted, watching the island recede in the distance. The radio crackled faintly, then fell silent. Hours passed. He had no idea whether his crew had escaped, no idea if rescue would come. Alone in the Pacific, he floated under a blazing sun, surrounded by silence and horizon. Then, just as his hope began to fade, the shadow of a submarine broke the surface nearby. It was the USS Finback, an American sub on patrol. Sailors waved from the deck as the sub's crew pulled him aboard, wrapping him in blankets. Exhausted but alive, Bush became one of the countless airmen rescued by the Navy's growing network of search and rescue operations, many of which were coordinated by Avengers equipped for spotting and radio guidance. News of the incident spread quickly through the fleet. The story of the young pilot who survived against all odds, and whose Avenger had kept flying long enough for him to escape, became part of the aircraft's legend. The plane's rugged construction had once again proven itself. Even burning, even crippled, it had bought its pilot the precious seconds he needed to live. For Bush, the experience was life-changing. He returned to duty after his rescue, completing more missions before the war's end. For the Avenger, it was another chapter in a growing reputation, a machine that protected its crews with almost uncanny resilience. By late 1944, the Avenger had earned a quiet reverence among pilots. They spoke of it not as a weapon but as a partner, something that stayed with you when everything else went wrong. Ground crews treated them like living creatures, patching holes, repainting markings, sending them out again and again. Some aircraft flew over 100 missions, returning each time scarred but unbroken. And yet, even as it carried young men like Bush safely home, the Avenger's mission was changing. The war was entering its final, desperate phase. The islands ahead, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and finally Japan itself, would demand even more from the crews and their machines. Every mile forward meant longer flights, heavier loads, and greater risk. As 1945 dawned, the Avenger stood ready for its final proving ground. It had started as an experimental torpedo bomber, survived fire, skepticism, and war itself, and now it was about to become the indispensable heart of naval aviation's most demanding campaigns. By the beginning of 1945, the Avenger was no longer just a torpedo bomber. It had become the Navy's universal tool for almost every mission over the Pacific. The great battles of the final year were approaching, and the aircraft that had once struggled to convince skeptics was now at the very center of operations. The campaigns for Iwo Jima and Okinawa would test not only the courage of the crews but the very limits of their machines. In February, the American fleet assembled off Iwo Jima, a tiny volcanic island halfway between the Marianas and Japan. Its importance lay in its airfields, future emergency landing sites for B-29 bombers returning from raids on the Japanese mainland. The island itself was a fortress, its beaches lined with defenses and its skies filled with smoke. The Avenger's mission was to clear the way. Flying from carriers stationed miles offshore, Avenger squadrons launched daily, carrying a mix of bombs, rockets, and depth charges. Their job was to hit artillery positions, cave openings, and supply depots hidden in the rugged terrain. They flew low over the island, sometimes below the cloud cover, using radar to find their targets through smoke and dust. The large bomb bay that had once held torpedoes was now packed with fragmentation bombs and rockets. When released in rapid succession, they tore open enemy bunkers and cleared ground for the advancing Marines. Pilots described the air as thick with ash, the ocean below dotted with landing craft. The Avenger's big radial engine roared steadily, shrugging off the grit and heat. Many aircraft returned to the carriers streaked with dust and volcanic soot, their paint blistered, but their engines still running perfectly. Even under these punishing conditions, maintenance crews kept them flying day after day. From Iwo Jima, the fleet moved on to Okinawa, the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War. Here, the Avenger's versatility reached its peak. The island's proximity to Japan meant constant attacks from kamikaze aircraft. Avengers flew round-the-clock patrols to spot incoming planes long before they reached the fleet. Some carried small airborne radars, their operators scanning the dark for flickers of movement. When contact appeared, they relayed the bearing to destroyers and fighter squadrons waiting below. Others patrolled the sea itself. Japanese submarines were still a constant danger to the invasion fleet, and the Avenger's endurance made it ideal for anti-submarine patrols. Fitted with depth charges, rockets, and acoustic torpedoes, the aircraft could sweep vast stretches of ocean. Once radar or sonar buoys detected a contact, Avengers would swoop low and drop their payload, then circle to confirm the kill. These missions were slow and tense, hours of empty sea, broken by a single flicker on a screen and a sudden rush to attack. Okinawa was also where the Avengers' humanitarian role became clear. As fighting raged, dozens of pilots were forced to ditch in the ocean after running out of fuel or sustaining damage. Avengers were often the first to spot them. Crews carried smoke markers, inflatable rafts, and radio transmitters. They would descend low, drop supplies, and guide rescue ships toward the survivors. The same aircraft that had once carried torpedoes now carried hope. The work was relentless. Every day, the carriers launched new waves. Every night, maintenance crews swarmed over the decks, refueling, rearming, and repairing. The Avengers' engines rarely cooled. Their pilots learned to navigate by instinct, through cloud, rain, and darkness, guided only by dim cockpit lights and the voice of a radio man calling out bearings. By spring, the Avenger had proven something extraordinary. It could do everything. It was an attack aircraft, a bomber, a patrol craft, a radar platform, even a lifeboat when needed. Its heavy construction, once criticized, now made it ideal for the grueling tempo of modern naval war. One squadron commander summed it up best: "The Avenger isn't fast, but it never quits." As Japan's defenses began to collapse, the Avengers continued their strikes deeper into the home islands. They hit shipping convoys, airfields, and naval bases, often flying missions that lasted up to 8 hours. Some carried radar-guided bombs, others experimented with sonobuoys, floating sensors that could detect submarines under the surface. Each new adaptation showed how far the design could stretch. When victory finally came in August, the Avengers were still flying, still patrolling, still scanning the horizon. They had fought from the first desperate months after Pearl Harbor to the final approach on Japan. No other aircraft had remained so constant, so adaptable, or so reliable throughout the war's long and shifting demands. But peace did not mean the end of the Avenger service. As new jet fighters began to dominate the skies, the old propeller-driven bomber found new life in quieter roles. The Navy, recognizing its range and stability, refitted hundreds of Avengers for new duties: search and rescue, weather observation, and most importantly, anti-submarine warfare during the rising tensions of the post-war world. The war that had forged the Avenger was over, but the lessons it embodied, endurance, adaptability, and the quiet strength of sound engineering, were just beginning to shape the future. When the guns of the Pacific finally fell silent, most of America's warplanes were sent to scrapyards or storage hangars. But the Avenger, that heavy, overbuilt, endlessly adaptable machine, refused to fade away. While faster jets began to fill carrier decks, the Avenger found a second life in roles that demanded patience, endurance, and reliability rather than speed. The new era of conflict was not one of vast fleets clashing in open seas, but of invisible hunters beneath the waves. The world had entered the age of the submarine, and in this new kind of war, the Avenger was suddenly more valuable than ever. The US Navy quickly converted many surviving TBM-3 Avengers into specialized anti-submarine aircraft. The big bomb bay that had once carried torpedoes now housed radar systems, sonar buoys, and depth charges. In the Atlantic, German U-boats were still a menace even after Germany's surrender. Some refused to surrender, disappearing into the vastness of the ocean. Avengers began patrolling the convoy routes between America and Europe, their radar dishes sweeping the sea surface for the telltale shape of a periscope or conning tower. When a contact appeared, the crew would drop sonar buoys, creating a network of underwater microphones. Guided by the faint echoes of sound, the Avenger would line up for an attack, releasing depth charges or the new acoustic torpedo that homed in on propeller noise. These patrols were long and lonely. Hours spent over endless blue, broken only by the faint hum of engines and the crackle of radio reports. But for many aircrews, the Avenger's solid feel and steady flight were a comfort. It could take off in rough weather, stay aloft for nearly 9 hours, and always brought its crew home. Pilots came to call it the plane that forgives mistakes. Soon, the Avenger's role expanded beyond the American Navy. Britain's Royal Navy, which had already operated Avengers during the war under the name Tarpon, kept them in service as anti-submarine aircraft from their small escort carriers. The Royal Canadian Navy followed suit, using Avengers to patrol the icy waters of the North Atlantic. These Canadian versions, designated AS-3, were fitted with long magnetic detection booms extending from the tail, designed to sense the faint magnetic field of a submerged submarine. Canadian crews flew these modified Avengers well into the 1950s, braving freezing winds and blizzards as they scanned for Soviet submarines slipping under the Arctic ice. The aircraft's roomy interior allowed for new electronics, radar displays, and heating systems, luxuries by wartime standards. Though outdated compared to jets, the Avenger remained unmatched for endurance. Other countries soon adopted it too. France used Avengers during the conflicts in Indochina, operating from the carrier Aramanches. The Netherlands deployed them aboard the Karel Doorman. Brazil and Uruguay bought small numbers for coastal patrol. Japan, now an ally under its new self-defense forces, flew Avengers for maritime reconnaissance until the early 1960s. In every corner of the world, this aircraft that had once hunted battleships now watched over seas in peacetime. The Avenger's versatility also made it a natural platform for innovation. Engineers began experimenting with a new concept, airborne early warning, using radar-equipped aircraft to detect incoming threats far beyond a fleet's line of sight. The result was the TBM-3W, a modified Avenger carrying a massive radar dish in a ventral pod. This early warning Avenger was a pioneer, the ancestor of today's E-2 Hawkeye. It could spot aircraft or ships hundreds of miles away, providing real-time data to carrier groups. Another variant, the TBM-3S, specialized in tracking submarines. It carried the latest sonobuoys and could coordinate attacks with destroyers through radio link. With each new adaptation, the Avenger seemed to reinvent itself, evolving from a torpedo bomber into a flying command post, a guardian of fleets, and even a scientific platform. Some Avengers were converted for weather reconnaissance. They flew directly into tropical storms to collect data, missions that demanded the same toughness that had once carried them through flak and fire. Others served as air ambulances, their bomb bays refitted with stretchers and medical gear to evacuate wounded sailors from remote islands. Even Hollywood found a use for them. In the late 1940s, surplus Avengers were sold to civilian owners who used them for firefighting and aerial photography. Their huge wings and slow, steady handling made them ideal for dropping water or carrying heavy camera rigs. By the early 1950s, though, time finally began to catch up with the old warhorse. Jet-powered aircraft were faster, sleeker, and more modern. Yet even as the Navy phased them out of frontline service, the Avengers still flew in reserve squadrons, training schools, and experimental roles. The final US Navy Avengers were retired in 1954, a full 13 years after the first prototype took off. For a design born in the shadow of doubt, it was an astonishing career. From the fiery skies of Midway to the cold silence of the North Atlantic, the Avenger had done it all, and in doing so, it helped shape the very future of naval aviation. But its influence didn't end with its last flight. The engineers who built it had unknowingly created a blueprint for every combat aircraft that followed, one that valued survivability, adaptability, and the human life inside the cockpit above all else. Behind every successful flight of the Avenger lay an idea that survival wasn't just luck or bravery, but something that could be built, measured, and engineered. When the war ended, military designers all over the world began to study the aircraft that had outlasted them all, and what they found inside the Avenger's thick metal skin reshaped how future generations of planes would be built. At first glance, the TBF seemed almost crude, a huge barrel-shaped fuselage, heavy armor plating, thick wings, and hundreds of cables and wires running through its frame. But engineers soon realized that none of it was wasted. Every added pound, every layer of redundancy, existed for one purpose: to bring the crew home alive. The most striking innovation was its electrical system. During the early 1940s, most combat aircraft relied on hydraulics to power flaps, landing gear, and gun turrets. Hydraulic lines were efficient but fragile. A single hit could spray fluid and leave the pilot helpless. The Avenger's designers, led by Leroy Grumman and Chief Engineer Robert Hall, took a radical risk. They replaced most of those systems with electrical ones. The dorsal gun turret, for example, used an electrically powered motor that allowed for fast, precise tracking of attacking aircraft. Critics had called it overcomplicated. In practice, it proved nearly indestructible. Even when power was partially lost, it kept moving just enough for the gunner to defend his crew. Then there was the wing. The Avenger's massive 54-foot span created a new challenge. It was simply too large for the tight elevators and hangars of carrier ships. Grumman himself solved this in his office using nothing but a pencil, paper clips, and a pink eraser. He twisted the clips to simulate folding wings and discovered that by changing the angle of the hinge, the wings could fold both upward and backward at once. The result was the now famous stow wing design, a compound hinge that reduced the wingspan to just 18 feet when folded. It looked almost like origami, and it became a hallmark of Grumman aircraft for decades. That clever mechanism, which engineers once worried would jam or break, became one of the most reliable in service. Pilots joked that the wings folded more smoothly than their bunks. And its success had a deeper meaning. It showed that complexity, when designed with purpose, didn't weaken an aircraft, it made it capable of more. The same logic guided the rest of the Avenger's design. Its fuel tanks were self-sealing, lined with thick rubber layers that expanded when pierced. Its armor was distributed strategically, protecting the cockpit, engine, and control lines without adding unnecessary weight to less critical areas. Even the bomb bay doors, which opened and closed with precision under extreme pressure, were engineered to function after damage. Everything was built with the assumption that something would go wrong, and that the plane still needed to finish the mission. This philosophy, sometimes called over-engineering, became the cornerstone of American aircraft design in the decades that followed. The idea was simple: don't build something just to work, build it to survive failure. The Avenger was the proof that such a philosophy paid off. Its record during the war was unmatched: nearly 10,000 built, over 46,000 combat sorties flown, and only about 1.5% lost in action, one of the lowest loss rates of any combat aircraft in history. More than the numbers, though, it was what those numbers meant. Every 0.1% represented hundreds of crews who made it home. Every system that kept running after damage represented another mission completed. The aircraft's resilience saved not only lives but experience. Veteran pilots who could train the next generation, mechanics who learned to repair instead of replace, engineers who learned to think beyond the limits of simplicity. In post-war interviews, Grumman's team often said they didn't aim to build the prettiest aircraft or even the fastest. Their goal was the plane that brings you back. They achieved it through brute force logic: thicker armor where it mattered, multiple control paths, reinforced landing gear, and the use of components that could still operate even if half the system failed. That design philosophy became standard in later Navy aircraft, from the F-6F Hellcat to the F-14 Tomcat. Even decades later, engineers studying wrecked Avengers from the ocean floor found remarkable details: wiring harnesses still intact, landing gear joints preserved, and bulkheads that had absorbed impacts far beyond what early tests predicted. Every nut and rivet carried the same message: this was an aircraft meant to endure. It also redefined what multi-role meant in aviation. The Avenger was not a specialized weapon like many of its contemporaries. It was a framework, a machine built to evolve. Its internal bay could carry torpedoes one day, radar the next, or passengers, fuel tanks, and medical supplies if the mission demanded. Its adaptability foreshadowed the very concept of the modern multi-role aircraft. The aircraft's designers could not have known that they were shaping the future, but they did. The Avenger's DNA lived on in the jet age, in every system designed with redundancy, in every cockpit reinforced to protect its pilot, in every carrier plane built to take punishment and still return to deck. It wasn't just a bomber anymore. It was the blueprint for survivability. By the time the last Avenger left frontline service, its legacy was already secure, not in museums or headlines, but in the quiet assurance that its lessons had become part of how all aircraft were built thereafter. While the Avenger's design reflected bold thinking, its true triumph came from the way America built it. Producing nearly 10,000 of these massive machines in just 3 years demanded not just ingenuity, but the reinvention of an entire industry. It wasn't enough for the Avenger to be tough. It also had to be built faster, cheaper, and more efficiently than any combat aircraft before it. When Grumman received the Navy contract in late 1940, their facilities on Long Island were small, meant for producing fighters in limited numbers. The TBF was far too large, too complex, and far too heavy for a company of that size to build at scale. But war had no patience for limits. America's industrial heart was being transformed, and soon, Grumman would have help from an unlikely partner, General Motors. At first, the idea sounded absurd. GM was an automobile manufacturer. Its workers built Buicks and Chevrolets, not bombers. The company had never produced a single aircraft before. But the War Production Board believed that the future of victory lay in adapting civilian industries to military needs. They proposed that GM take over Avenger production while Grumman focused on fighters. What followed became one of the most extraordinary industrial conversions in history. To make this possible, engineers at Grumman built a special demonstration aircraft held together entirely with sheet metal screws. This PK Avenger, named for the Parker Kalin Screw Company, could be disassembled like a giant mechanical puzzle. They shipped it to GM's Eastern Aircraft Division in Trenton, New Jersey, where teams of car engineers took it apart piece by piece, learning how it worked. Then, they re-engineered it, not to change the design, but to make it suitable for automobile-style mass production. On the car assembly lines, everything moved with rhythm and precision. Parts arrived just in time, workers specialized in single tasks, and the pace never stopped. Now, those same methods were applied to building bombers. GM retooled its plants overnight. Car assembly stations became airframe lines. Mechanics trained in automotive welding learned aircraft riveting. Paint booths that once sprayed car doors now coated giant aluminum wings. By mid-1943, the first GM-built TBM Avengers began rolling out. They looked identical to Grumman's originals, but their serial numbers told a story of scale. In the end, General Motors produced more than 3 times as many Avengers as Grumman itself, over 7,500 aircraft in total. At the peak of production, GM's factories turned out more than 200 Avengers per month. Thousands of workers, many of them women entering industry for the first time, kept the assembly lines moving around the clock. Photographs from the time show rows of fuselages suspended in vast factory halls, wings stacked like metallic feathers, and technicians testing engines under clouds of exhaust. It was the very image of America's wartime power, ordinary citizens building extraordinary machines. The speed and precision were staggering. Each TBM required roughly 30,000 parts, 12 miles of wiring, and over 40,000 rivets. Yet production never slowed. Engineers at GM created modular subassemblies, allowing wings, engines, and turrets to be built separately, then joined in final assembly. Quality inspectors monitored every step, ensuring that despite the pace, no corners were cut. The Navy's acceptance rate for TBMs exceeded 98%. The Avengers production became a symbol of what the Allies called the arsenal of democracy. It showed that industrial power could win wars just as decisively as tactics or technology. In speeches, American leaders pointed to the Avenger as proof that a free nation could outproduce any dictatorship through cooperation and innovation. The partnership also left lasting marks on both companies. For GM, the experience transformed how it approached manufacturing. Concepts like modular design, flexible tooling, and standardized parts, born from Avenger production, would later shape the post-war car industry. For Grumman, it meant the chance to focus on newer, faster aircraft like the F-6F Hellcat and later the F-9 Panther. But beyond the numbers and assembly lines, there was a deeper story, one of human effort. Each completed Avenger represented thousands of hands, from machinists to draftsmen, inspectors to pilots. Workers scrawled their initials inside panels and on landing gear doors, small signatures hidden within the aircraft's metal. Many would later visit airfields and point to Avengers taking off, saying quietly, "I built that one." By 1945, the combined output of Grumman and General Motors had delivered nearly 10,000 Avengers to the Navy. They served in every ocean, with every fleet, in every type of mission imaginable. Few other wartime aircraft were built in such numbers or used with such consistency from beginning to end. And yet, even this industrial miracle would have meant little if the aircraft itself hadn't lived up to its reputation. Fortunately, the Avenger not only met expectations, it exceeded them in every possible way. Its durability, its ability to absorb punishment and keep flying, made it beloved by crews. Its sheer presence on the carrier deck, large, solid, and dependable, gave everyone who saw it the same feeling. This was a machine built to win. As the war drew to its end and production lines finally slowed, the last Avengers left the factories to the sound of cheers. Workers hung signs reading "Mission Complete" above the assembly bays. The war had proven that even the most overcomplicated design could become the backbone of victory when paired with human determination. When the war finally ended, the Avengers stood lined up across carrier decks and airfields, silent giants of metal and oil, their missions complete. Some would be scrapped, others sold, and a few would find new life in distant corners of the world. But the story of the Avenger didn't end with its last flight. Its legacy lived on in the way humanity thought about machines, and about the people who trusted them with their lives. The Avenger had proved something profound, that true engineering excellence was not about elegance or simplicity alone, but about foresight, the ability to imagine failure and build through it. It wasn't the sleekest or the fastest aircraft of its time, but it was one of the few designed to survive the unpredictable. Its creators had accepted that perfection was impossible in war, and instead built a machine that could endure imperfection better than any other. In that sense, the Avenger was more than an airplane. It was a philosophy made of metal. Every bolt and bracket told a story of respect for the crew who would sit inside it. Grumman's engineers didn't see their job as creating a tool. They saw it as building a promise. A promise that even in chaos, even when everything went wrong, the aircraft would still have one last chance to bring its crew home. For many who flew it, that promise held true. Decades after the war, pilots still remembered the sound of its big radial engine starting up, a deep, confident growl that shook the carrier deck. They remembered the feeling of lifting off, the wings unfolding against the sunrise, and the strange comfort of knowing that beneath them was a machine that had never let them down. It wasn't graceful, but it was loyal, the kind of loyalty that machines rarely achieve. In the decades that followed, aviation moved faster than anyone could have imagined. Jets replaced propellers, computers replaced dials, and cockpits became more like spacecraft than airplanes. But deep inside every new aircraft design, there remained a trace of the Avengers' DNA, the insistence on redundancy, the refusal to depend on a single system, the belief that the pilot's life mattered more than any performance metric. That design philosophy carried forward into the Cold War era. The Navy's new jets, like the A-6 Intruder and the F-14 Tomcat, bore the invisible fingerprints of the Avengers' lessons. Their engineers had inherited not just blueprints, but an attitude, one that saw strength not as weight, but as resilience. Each of those aircraft owed something to the old torpedo bomber that had once been doubted, then revered. Even outside the military, the Avengers' influence lingered. The safety redundancies in commercial airliners, the structural reinforcements in rescue helicopters, even the storm research planes that fly into hurricanes, all trace their lineage back to ideas first proven inside the Avengers' aluminum skin. It had taught the world that over-engineering wasn't wasteful when lives were at stake. In the 1950s and 60s, as surviving Avengers were retired or sold, some found peaceful new purposes. Firefighting crews in Canada and the United States converted them into water bombers, using the same bomb bays that had once carried torpedoes to drop thousands of gallons of water over burning forests. Others served as agricultural aircraft, spreading seeds or fertilizer across farmland. The same sturdy airframe that had endured war now helped protect and rebuild the world it had once fought to save. And still, in small museums and hangars today, a few Avengers continue to fly. Their engines rumble like echoes of another century, and when they lift off, you can almost imagine the deck of a carrier beneath them, the ocean stretching endlessly below. To the pilots who fly them now, these machines are living relics, reminders of an era when courage and engineering met in equal measure. What made the Avenger endure wasn't just its metal or its might. It was its purpose. It was built for people, not just for war. Every rivet and panel represented a belief that life could be preserved through design, that survival could be engineered. And that belief, more than any weapon or tactic, helped define an entire generation of technology. As the sun set on the age of propeller-driven flight, the Avenger faded into history, but not into obscurity. Its shadow stretched across every innovation that followed. It was the aircraft that shouldn't have worked, yet always did. The one that engineers overbuilt, pilots underestimated, and history ultimately celebrated. And somewhere in the endless blue above the ocean, you can still imagine it, that twin-tailed silhouette gliding steadily through the clouds, wings wide, engine steady, carrying with it the quiet legacy of all those who built it, flew it, and trusted it to bring them home.